Hello everyone, welcome to the Share Your Green Design podcast. Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder that you can follow and subscribe to us over on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also find the full video version of each episode over on YouTube. We're also on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and WeChat at Share Your Green Design. That's all one word, Share Your Green Design. And remember, the podcast is only one small part of what is an ever-growing platform. So head on over to shareyourgreendesign.com to keep up to date with the latest in sustainable architecture, engineering, and construction. We've got projects, news, research, events, competitions, student work, jobs, everything you need. We'd love to have you as a visitor, but also as a contributor, so you're always welcome to send us your own projects, ideas, events, job openings, and much more. You'll find all the details on shareyourgreendesign.com. Once again, that's shareyourgreendesign.com. Thank you again for your support, and with that, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. To people that don't know you, then, could you introduce yourself more broadly, just your background, maybe where you are in the world and what you're doing?
Sure. I'm originally from Winnipeg in the middle of Canada. Grew up there, and after high school and actually moved to Ireland for a year when I was 19 to get out of Canada and make some money and travel around Europe. So connect to your part of the world.
We're definitely going to get.
What's that?
We're definitely going to get to that. So, but go on.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Go on.
Yeah, and then did my undergrad in architecture in Manitoba, and then I chose to go to Toronto for my master's degree. And then, from there, work in a variety of kind of opportunities brought me kind of around the world. I worked for a firm based in Toronto that did a lot of mining sector work, and spent about 2 years going around and working on mine sites, either working with the communities that are around them, or the people that worked at them. After that, was always interested in teaching. Took a job at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard for 2 years, and on the back of that, met the folks that started MASS, and they were looking for someone to move to Rwanda to help lead the office that was quickly growing there. Spent about 5 years in Rwanda, and subsequently moved up to London, where my wife's job has brought us back to London here to have a couple kids, and we've been based here for the last 4 years. I'm an architect and Canadian, and I don't know. I don't know if that's a sufficient introduction.
No, definitely. The big question for me was, so whereabouts in Ireland were you?
I worked at 2 hotels tending bar, the K Club in County Kildare and
I know that.
Adair Manor in County Limerick. I love to golf, which is which was a prerequisite for both jobs. I made little money, but I was allowed to play golf once a week, so I was okay.
Yeah, I'm actually from Limerick, which is where Adair Manor. I'm kind of near to Adair Manor, and yeah, it's well known for its golf. Tiger Woods plays there a lot. Or there's
It was a lot different 20 years ago, I have to say, than it is now.
Yeah.
But where are you from?
I'm from Limerick and studied architecture in Belfast and worked in Dublin for a while. For people who don't know, Share Your Green Design, kind of an Irish-orientated website. Gwan, the founder, is from Dublin. I'm from Dublin. So it's a small world. Even our guest from Toronto/London/Rwanda also has an Irish connection. Who would have known?
In rural County Limerick for a good 6 months in the dead of winter.
And Limerick as well, yeah. But can I ask as well, the mining, that's interesting. Could you go in, elaborate a little bit on that? And what your kind of thoughts on that whole sector were?
Well, it's my thesis project when I was at University of Toronto was looking at the kind of long-term view for the oil sands, or the tar sands, as some people know it, in Alberta, Canada. This is back in 2008. It was interesting to think about it, because at that point, there was the idea of peak oil, and that we would be soon running out of oil, and that's why we needed to extract it out of this, this landscape in northern Alberta. So much has changed, obviously, since then. But, really, I understood Canada and its history and its urbanization as really directly connected to resource extraction. From our beginning, our whole country was based on extractive, economies.
Hmm.
And that led in a way to working with a firm based out of Toronto that more than half of the world's mining companies are either owned or operated either out of Toronto or Vancouver.
Wow.
So we learned how to dig holes in Canada, and now we know how to dig, and now we've taken that skill and basically dig holes all over the world, for better or worse. So, that brought me to places like Mongolia, Panama, Turkey, Zambia, on these large-scale resource extraction projects. Mostly copper mines, a couple gold mines,
Hmm.
and it left me with a real appreciation from what the other side of your decision making is. I know where things come from, and I know what the places look like where they come from in a way. And the more I've kind of reflected on that experience, it's really informed, I think, my worldview, but I really, from an architectural perspective, connecting it to the work then that I engaged in Rwanda, soon after, was the basic notion of architectural provenance, and your material selection. So, when you specify aluminum windows or aluminium windows, do you really know where they come from?
Yeah.
It's with metals specifically. It's a really complicated question, and one that we need to engage.
Hmm. Where then would you say sustainability came into your career, into your life? Where would you? Was there a moment that really piqued your interest in sustainability in a big way, or was this kind of like a slow burner that just gradually grew throughout your career to where you are now?
Well, I think anybody in architectural school, caring about the world, being educated to think about what sustainable architecture was. Mostly my education was around, energy efficiency and envelopes and air tightness and all that stuff. And I was always fairly skeptical of the word sustainability because I didn't really think, it really matched up to what we actually need. We need a kind of fundamentally different relationship with the planet.
Yeah.
The one we have is not sustainable. And it was a bit of a slow burn until I think, working in a place like Rwanda with Mass, where your decision making was far more immediate, learning to, source materials and wanting to source materials or systems, and knowing the end user and also knowing the person that made it. You're far more connected to your decision making, and I think that beyond just the environmental, operational efficiency, you begin to understand issues of, again, back to the real kind of upfront provenance, engaging that provenance discussion, and then got into embodied carbon, and I think that was the aha moment for me, was really understanding, the implications of my decision making day to day and what that resulted in, and then reflecting on the education that I'd had up to that point, how that was a completely absent notion in my education was kind of a shocking thing. And I think the real change in my mindset has been, one, having a child, I think has kind of bit of a shift in my thinking. Certainly, I think that's pretty typical. And then the kind of that coinciding with 4 years ago, there's one day where, on the same day, Greta Thunberg was giving a very impassioned, angry speech in Paris, if you recall.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah.
And that same day, I got an email from my professional body telling me that the path to 2030 included, 4 different ways to pack your building with petrochemical foams. And I kind of just saw, I was like this, this is what's going on here, right? I can see why she's angry. This is utter nonsense. And since then, I think that kind of really became passionate about how do we deal with this, because the way that I had been educated and continued to be educated through my professional body was completely irresponsible. All the best intentions, but knowing what we know now, once you see embodied carbon, you can't unsee it.
Yeah, exactly. You've mentioned a few times then about Africa and Rwanda, because you spent, did you say 8 years in Rwanda?
Well, better part of 5 years.
5 years.
There. Yeah.
With Mass Group, right? You were there on behalf of Mass.
Yep.
Cool. So how would you compare the approach or the attitude to sustainability or circularity in in Rwanda or in the African context versus everywhere else you've been, London, Toronto, North America, Europe.
Yeah.
What are
Yeah.
what are some of the kind of differences and similarities between those parts of the world, do you think?
Yeah, so I think the main thing in a Western context, or certainly a North American context, our buildings are incredibly complicated and have global reach. If you just think about a sealed unit in a window,
Yeah.
right? You begin to think about what's in that. Where's the glass come from? Where's the gas come from that's in the unit? Where's that argon made? Where's the aluminum in that kind of sealed unit? Never mind the gaskets and the sealants and all that kind of stuff, right? Like you begin to unpack that, and you immediately, it becomes very difficult to answer that question. Having gone down this road with my friend who works at a window supplier, very quickly you lose track of where things come from. And it's just indicative of, a global system that we've kind of built. In Rwanda, coming to mass, the first project I had at the Munini Hospital, that same window, I kind of, drew a dumb rectangle and said, window of this dimension. And our quantity surveyor, who Bruce, who'd been working there building buildings for 10 years, he's like, okay, Kelly, but, what size glazing do you want? I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, if it's this big, I can get it on a truck from Tanzania. If it's this big, it comes from Kenya. This big can be tempered. This big is not. If it's this big, you need a steel section of this size, and that also will either come from Tanzania, or I might have to get it from Dubai via India. Or if we can go smaller, then we can have it, made out of the recycled stuff. And it's kind of like, wow, all these kind of decisions underpinning just this dumb rectangle of a window I'd drawn really revealed, everything kind of underneath it. I'd never thought to ask, or certainly for some reason wasn't trained to think through. And like that moment was like, oh, wow. Okay. So, and our whole approach, I think, at Mass was about social impact of construction, from the beginning. And in a way that came out of a necessity. Like the government of Rwanda has an 18% import tax, right? Mm-hmm. So that makes you want to figure out how to do things in country, and, to contextualize it. Rwanda's got the population of the Netherlands. It's about the same size and population of the Netherlands, right? So you're like, okay, small, kind of not the most, doesn't have any like large mineral content, and so but it's got a lot of people, and labor is the cheap component in the situation. It's like the inverse of a Western kind of context where you're looking to minimize labor. In Rwanda, we're always looking to maximize labor, and I think in that way, you see things completely differently, and that kind of just brought a different kind of completely different way of thinking about how we put buildings together and how we source them, and the decision makings that lead up to that. Mm-hmm. So, subsequently, practicing there since that window moment was every choice was, how do I maximize labor and seek to have this sourced domestically, because that's going to reduce cost, and it's also going to have the maximum kind of local impact.
Yeah. And again, it's almost the same strand that we started off, you talking about mining and mines. It's almost that same conversation about where materials come from. We take it for granted, as you say, we order an aluminium window. We don't know where the gas comes from, where the metal comes from, where the glass comes from, what process was made. I think that what I find remarkable is how that same issue of global you can call it an issue or a success or both of global interdependence. It seems that over recent years we're seeing the fragility of that system. Like we saw it with COVID, with everything from masks to vaccines to semiconductors. I think we're seeing now with the war in Ukraine, the stretch on food supplies, even in Europe and the UK. Obviously, oil and gas supplies through UK and through Russia. That for years, maybe even for decades, we've allowed this system to evolve where, and I guess you could say it's maybe driven by economy, driven by cost, by the lowest price wins of these ever more fragile, ever stretched global supply chains. Like you talked about how in university looking at mining. When I was in my master's, I was looking at food production. And it was incredible when you look at the map of like global food shipping how
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something like 70 or 80% of the world's grain passes through one or two of these like 10 global choke points, which are these really fraught or dangerous or unpredictable parts of the world, where any, like the Suez Canal is one where one ship goes awry, it causes havoc. And I don't know what the future is of that system. I think for a long time we took it for granted, and I think that in recent years more and more people are starting to wake up and just starting to question: is this really the way it has to be? From a convenience point of view, from a sustainability point of view, from a security point of view. And it's interesting listening to you talk about Rwanda, about the glass and the windows, that I think like a decade ago you would have said to a lot of people, you would have described that system and they might have said, oh, that sounds a bit underdeveloped, or that sounds a bit primitive almost. You describe it to them now, that makes a lot of sense. You'd probably get a building built a lot faster now with that system than you would, and cheaper than you would with the system that we often use in the West.
Yeah, I think that the last few years have really, like you said, have shown how fragile and frankly unsustainable the whole thing is. Yeah. What the 80s and 90s have done to the global economy, we've lived the most privileged life in the history of humanity. And I mean, to be kind of realist about it, things are going to change dramatically. I think that was the answer. Although, typically when I presented this work a few years ago, it'd be like, well, yeah, sure, you can do that in Rwanda, but how do you do that in, name Western country? Because our supply chains are so sophisticated. And like that word, replace that word sophisticated with like exploitative or what it actually is.
Yeah.
Because you don't with so many things that we purchase. But again, back to buildings, like that. Do you have any sense that what the labor of your window supply chain was? Are you sure that there wasn't slavery or children involved? And if you can't say no definitively, you're not acting responsibly, I would say, right? Like the big parallel and shift is the big parallel is clearly our food systems. I mean, to your point, right? Like how the move certainly in the last decade, but towards more regional eating, more farm to table, more organic, all of these things that have emerged, let's say, in Western food culture, let's say, because there's certainly lots of the world where that was always the thing and has never changed. I think that the more we pay attention to our diets and the provenance of our food, which just begs the question, why should we not be doing this with everything in our kind of our, say, consumption, and again, specifically buildings, which are, incredibly complex, include thousands of things to make them, never mind the like 10 things of the ingredients of your salad at lunch. Like it's, but that shift needs to happen. And moreover, buildings 100 years ago were regional. I think it doesn't require a huge stretch of the imagination to think about what architecture would look like. I mean, I look out the window here. I'm on Tottenham Court Road, downtown London. I can see a building built 100 years ago, and that brick was sourced regionally. Like it wasn't imported from Denmark or Germany. And that comes with, I mean, then the follow-on. Well, that's too expensive. Labor's too expensive. Well, we need to. I think the whole thing needs to unravel a little bit. Like we need to just untangle the connective threads that span far, far too far away from us, and make architecture more of a regional practice again. If we have any sense, if we've got any, hope of addressing the climate emergency specifically.
Speaking of food then and agriculture, obviously this dovetails kind of nicely into one of the projects that you worked on in Rwanda, the RICA, the Rwanda Institute of Conservation and Agriculture. I think what you've been speaking about, the idea of architecture and sustainable architecture, it's not just about building form, it's about the careful choice of materials and labor, as well as building form, and even building use speaks to as well to sustainable principles. Could you just kind of give an introduction or slightly unpack that project? Because I think it's a really good example of almost everything we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I think certainly RICA was the capstone of my time in Rwanda. It was an incredible opportunity where we were brought in early on by the Howard G. Buffett Foundation. He had a vision of creating a school of agriculture in Rwanda, and sees that basically food production and yield is a real source of conflict in that part of the world, and conflict everywhere, right? If we're if we're fed, we're going to be content, and the opportunities for peace are that much greater. And specifically an approach of conservation agriculture, which is not. It's looking to a kind of form of regenerative agriculture. We're looking at things like agroforestry to include, basically bring ecological diversity in with yield, and not these two things that are often, I'd say, in kind of modern industrial agriculture at odds with each other. We won the job by pitching the idea of a One Health approach, and this notion of One Health coming out of the fields of public health, where you have to understand that human health is inextricably tied to ecological health. And clearly, we pitched this 6 years ago. I mean, I think COVID reveals this, that plant and animal health and ours are inextricably linked, and we can't disassociate these. And that played through in the design of this campus by marrying habitat and the property that we worked in was actually used to be a national park. So we looked at expanding the area that was habitat, having a conservation area around it, within the agricultural areas, having kind of patches of rebuilding the habitat along the lakefront, for example. And then from the student experience, the idea of a kind of heuristic learning environment where in their first year they live together and they kind of operate their own farm. Many of them don't have agricultural backgrounds, so they kind of learn the small farmer experience in their first year together. Where they have a few chickens, a few goats, a few cows. They operate 7-acre farm, and then from there they go through the program and kind of specialize in larger scale enterprises with the hope of creating entrepreneurship in agriculture. Architecturally and in the landscape, we saw this as an opportunity to really push the boundaries of our thinking around climate positive design. So we got into embodied carbon through a project in Congo a few years prior, and really saw that the main things to do were just like, how do you reduce cement and steel as much as possible, and how do you not fire things, right? And the soil of that area, we conducted some extensive kind of studies on site to figure out what the soil mix was, and with our engineering team, basically we wanted to harvest the project from the site. We wanted to use an agricultural approach. So the buildings are largely rammed earth or compressed earth block done on site. So that really reduces shipping. There's not a lot of trucks coming and going.
Yeah.
Rammed earth and compressed earth blocks do not require firing, and they happen pretty quickly, and they're great for labor. Again, you've got people basically just banging bricks out all day.
Mm-hmm.
As the roof structure, as a Canadian who's always been taught how to do stuff out of wood, like we really wanted to push wood instead of steel, which was, most all spanning structures in that part of the world are steel or concrete. So we really, our engineering team did some incredible things in working with finding the right sources of sustainable timber in the region, which are not a lot of, doing a lot of like testing to what dimensions can we get, what's the right way to treat it, and designing around the limitations of existing sources. So not just saying, well, we want a 12-foot, 2x6. Okay, well, what do you have, and we'll figure out how to design around it. Mm-hmm. Which I think really is a kind of constraints-based design approach, which yields, I think, more interesting results. And then the roof is a kind of Roman tile that we got a custom version of a Roman tile for all the roofing, which is great from kind of heat gain perspective. And then the whole campus is, it's a pretty hot, dry part of the country. Mm-hmm. So really focused around natural daylight and passive ventilation. So if you see this project, you can see a lot of the kind of other butterfly roofs or skylight, sawtooth roof patterns for the academic and enterprise buildings. Mm-hmm. The entire thing's off grid, so it's got the second largest array in the whole country. The water system works on a cycle with the lake. We worked with Arup to design that whole system. So 100% off grid. Wow. And the lowest embodied carbon project we've ever done per square meter. And I think we figured out by afforesting about, I think, just off the top of my mind, I think afforesting about 10 hectares of the site we could zero out the project its emissions, in the next 12 years.
Wow.
So, I mean, I think this is, also offers the on-site potentials for sequestration to really be climate positive.
Yeah.
And so it's on the front cover of the RIBA, built environment report as a result. I think it's it's wrapping up this year, and I'm certainly hopeful that people are going to see it as a beacon of what climate positive design can be.
Absolutely. I mean, people really should look it up, because if you architecturally, am I right saying that it's 6 different buildings which are kind of dotted around this?
54 different buildings.
54.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was 6. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. It's 54 buildings across the campus. Yeah.
Good Lord. But when you see it, even if you took principles and design intent away and sustainability away for a moment, just to look at the scheme as an architectural project, aesthetically, it's beautiful. And I think it speaks to the importance or the power of architecture, particularly educational architecture, or something around a curriculum, around education, around teaching, that when you have students learning either a craft or a method related to sustainability or related to sustainable concepts, to be able to do it in a setting or in an architectural setting which also espouses those concepts is extremely important, because it's almost, you often hear this phrase, do as I say, not as I do, and almost kind of talking down to people. But to be able to immerse students in this kind of holistic environment where you can see that sustainability and circularity were at the forefront. It's a statement. It's not just a statement to architects and to our community. It's very much also a statement to students, and maybe even just to everyday Rwandans, that we're not just talking here. We're acting. We're trying to set a benchmark, a global benchmark. And yeah, it speaks to the power of architecture, I think, and the power of sustainable architecture. Again, it goes beyond the credentials of the building itself. It's also what that building says about kind of a larger mission.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm massively always believed in beauty, and things have to be beautiful too. Like, they can't just be purely functional. And I think that is the transmissibility of the idea of it. The real hope is that these people will graduate, go off, and they might design their chicken barn to look like the one at RICA, for instance, right? And use the same materials. Like, I saw how that barn was built. Instead of using a bunch of concrete block and a steel roof for my cow, I'm going to actually, put a tile on the top of it so the space doesn't overheat. For example, right? Just those, I think, transmissible, simple ideas. And frankly, we learned a lot from the vernacular architecture of Rwanda. Historically, it was all mud brick and clay tile. That's how people have been building for decades and decades and decades. And it's kind of just bringing it back to that. And on the back of all this kind of research around the materials, our engineering team is now working with the government to basically develop building code standards around earth construction, to make mud bricks, legal and, dignified, that people see it as like a form of construction that is not looked down upon, which it had been, fairly recently.
That's an interesting point. The episode right before this, we had Will Arnold. He's in the,
he worked on that project, so there you go.
It was the same project, I think, we're talking about.
He worked. Yeah.
And he mentioned about how the use of rammed earth bricks, it used to be looked down upon in an architectural context, because it was associated with poverty or people who couldn't afford concrete or steel, and that project and projects like that are playing an important role in redefining and kind of reorientating what the place that rammed earth has in society. And a lot of that, again, is down to architectural beauty and just showing what you can do. And I guess it's a statement as well that a major education institute is choosing this material as well to use rather than steel or concrete or anything. Because I was going to ask how difficult it was to immerse yourself in that vernacular way of thinking, but I guess you were there for, was it 5 years, which I guess it was a good bit of time to be able to to understand local building traditions and to be able to, for that to inform your design approach, because you do see sometimes architects they almost parachute into other countries, not necessarily just Africa, but anywhere around the world, and try to kind of at the last minute cram a lot of vernacular thinking into, and it ends up being a bit. I could even think of a few examples in Ireland by international architects, but it ends up being a bit. I don't want to say insulting, but very, very, very surface level, surface level, and a very kind of superficial approach. But I guess you were there for long enough that you were able to immerse yourself a bit more.
More than that, I mean, I walked into, Mass had been established, I think, for 5 or 6 years at the point that I started, and we have a, large team that's based there, a large Rwandan team too. So,
yeah, true.
I'm working with people who are from there or have spent a lot of time there. It's not, everything's done in a collaboration and a team, and lots of knowledge to leverage. And like I said, that kind of that moment, even with Bruce, who helped us build our first ever project, it's that, you stand to learn far more from the people that are there than you stand to tell them or teach them, always. And I think it just takes some time, some curiosity, and specifically humility in all of these situations where you're entering to pay attention and to listen.
So these days, then you're back in London, right? You're still with Mass in London.
Indeed.
Okay, and you am I right in saying you have a new role as well at Mass, director of sustainability and regenerative design? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
I got it in one. So do you want to just spell out what that role is and how it fits into the practice more broadly? Is it? Yeah. Does it entail a lot more kind of research and trying to kind of set standards, or do you kind of plug into particular projects across the office, or what does almost like a day look like in that role?
Good question. Pretty new. I think that the main intent is that we, it's a bit more cross-cutting, that every project has goals, clear targets. I think, that we're taking what we've learned on, say, aspirational projects like RICA, and even projects that have like small budgets or some limitations, that we're figuring out a way to move the whole practice towards, I think the radical requirements of us as a society here to be reducing our emissions. A very simplistic way of looking at it is like, the idea we need to have our emissions by 2030. That means we've got, 7 3/4 years left to do that. I've been going on about this for the last, 3 years before this, like that we need half by 2030, and we're still going up, right? So we need to do more than that now. We need to do less than half. And the building takes, 4 or 5 years. So the decisions we're making right now are so important. And so that whatever the project is, whatever the scale, we need to find the reductions, both in its construction, more in its construction than its operations. I think the time value of carbon, we have to get out of this kind of passive house, fascination, and just think about, how about building no house, or building less house, or reusing what we already have. I think certainly in North America, I'll speak to that. I'm excited to be coming back and working in Canada and the United States now, because I like to say we're the worst. We have the highest per capita emissions, and that has so much to do with how we built our cities, in our buildings. So we have too much floor area, and it's too spread out. And if North Americans can't figure out how to deal with this, then the whole world doesn't have a chance. So there's a huge challenge to just kind of reconceive what it means to live in this world, and specifically in a North American setting. And excited to kind of work with the whole team, which now we're just so much going on right now across the offices in the United States, and never mind the one in Rwanda, where we've got, I think, some opportunities to create, beacons like RICA for what architecture can be in the American setting.
Speaking of the North American setting, so as well as your work at Mass Group in London, you're also working a lot with the University of Toronto in Canada. It's in a more kind of an educational or a more academic kind of role. Do you want to quickly spell out what that is, and what your role there is, and what your preoccupation there is?
Sure. So, I think back to that aha moment, I started writing emails to my professional body and what are we doing about this, and wasn't getting anywhere, frankly. And kind of I figured, okay, another tack to take is the kind of show me, don't tell me. So approached the University of Toronto, said I'm really interested in teaching, about around embodied carbon and life cycle assessments to the students there. And they said, great, come on in. We have no one doing that, and you can do a research studio in the master's program.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, great. Came in and figured the best way to do this is to also engage the profession. Really wanted to use the academy as a catalyst to have a conversation more broadly for the city of Toronto. And inspired a little bit by Vancouver. Vancouver is the first city in Canada to have any embodied carbon policy, and I figured it's always a kind of rivalry. If Vancouver can do it, Toronto will want to do it, and vice versa. So the best way to start that was get some data. So approached 10 firms, friends of mine, say give us a building, and we'll run the numbers, and so did that last year, and got that data and brought it to the city of Toronto. Said, here's embodied carbon. Here's how we're doing as a starting point. Their green standards team, the people that kind of oversee the planning permissions from a sustainable performance perspective. Mm-hmm. They have a lot of operational metrics, and the head of the green standards team, Lisa King, came back to me after Christmas, and they're like, okay, how about we apply for a grant together? So we got a grant from the Atmospheric Fund in Toronto to basically push, add to this body of knowledge and start working towards embodied carbon policy for the next version of the green standards. And that's been going on for the last year now, and that's just wrapping up. Now we're in the last kind of stages of stakeholder engagement workshops and be writing a policy primer for it. So that'll hopefully go into planning law, next year, so that future buildings have to, begin to take account for this. I think through the process of all this too, it's been just in the last year or two, the absolute tidal wave of interest in this issue. Because I think anybody, again, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Yeah. And it's been really encouraging. I think all the feedback has been super encouraging as far as people on board and wanting to see something actually more aggressive than I'm based in London with what Letty and the GLA has just done here. Yeah. Toronto's like, well, we can do better than that. Let's try to be more aggressive, or even a lower bar, or higher bar, depending how you see it, from the get-go. So we'll see how that pans out. I'm optimistic.
Awesome.
And then this past year, I came back to do a second year, and as a counterpoint to all of the kind of concrete structures of Toronto this year I want to look at mass timber. So looked at projects not just in Toronto, but out in the West Coast, some Washington and Oregon. Two from the UK here, to the really project here in London, which is phenomenal with Watt Thistleton, and two projects in Sweden with White Architecture. And because I think there's so much hope in mass timber as far as a solution. Yeah. And there's parts of it that are that are certainly promising, but there's also realities with it. We can't consume our way out of this issue by just switching to wood. I mean, there's limitations on the forests that we have already. So it was really interesting. Again, that question of provenance with wood reveals some, rubs up pretty quickly against issues. It's not a green material, in many ways. It it's got a lot of land use problems of its own that we need to, as architects, really understand before we just kind of jump into what we think is the future.
That's interesting, because I think wood, maybe it's because the environmental impacts of concrete and steel, even watching concrete and steel being produced, is so it's so obviously energy intensive. Wood is often kind of held up as a holy grail. We don't maybe examine or seek to understand enough what the processes are, or what the impacts could be of mass timber. So in your own practice, do you still see wood as a more agreeable or approachable material for sustainability from concrete or steel, or do you think that even timber and wood alone in its current stage is also not enough to get us towards our climate goals? Do we need far more research or far more intensity needed in new materials like biomaterials that you often see floated or out of research labs, or do you think there is promise in timber, but we just need to interrogate much more how we're producing timber, regenerative timber, or how we're treating the land, or how we're kind of repopulating the land with timber after we extract it? What are your kind of thoughts on the future of materials there?
Okay, that's a big, complex question. The first would be, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both, and it's both in moderation. I see all three as the equivalent of like the proteins in your diet. Some are worse than others, but we should probably be not eating any of them as much as we currently do, right? So, that's if steel is beef and concrete is pork and wood is chicken, we still should be using more tofu, I would say, from a emissions perspective, or to push that metaphor more, just be fasting a bit more, right? We before we keep building, we need to address what we already have, and we need to make better use of what we already have. Certainly in Europe and North America, we have enough square footage, right? And it's this idea that we need to keep building and building is a misnomer. And how we take care of it. So, kind of to your second point, being here in England and seeing the Insulate Britain kind of protest.
Right.
I mean, this is, if I was in United Kingdom and Ireland and most of Europe, absolutely, we have enormous housing stock that needs to perform better. How do you get an entire country off of gas boilers and insulate it? Well, not adding more emissions in the process. I mean, what I'm kind of scared about this is that just everybody's going to be wrapping their buildings in foam, which will have the opposite effect, right? And this is where I think biogenic materials offer promise and hope. I mean, wood is a part of that. So is other materials that are already on market, like hemp-based or mycelium or you name it. I think that if we can grow it and if it's regenerative, it's probably a better. And it's not a high emitter in its manufacturing, like so much of the foam-based products are. That's a positive step. And I think that the other complexity here has so much to do with land use. I mean, forestry in Canada is a net emitter, and it has to do with so much about how we forest. I mean, the nature of forestry in northern Canada, it's kind of clear cutting. It's not a clear cut outcome. It depends where you're doing it. It's in a mountain or if it's in a flat boreal forest. Like the regeneration times are different. The same could be said of Sweden. I mean, the jury's out on Sweden's forestry practices there. If you're kind of familiar with it, there's a lot of debate happening in Sweden right now around how sustainable its forestry industry is. If you just think about Ireland for a second, or certainly the UK, and how much the country had been forested historically, which had been deforested over centuries of occupation, and now the current land use of Ireland and the UK, how much of it is pasture? And this is, I think, this is where I think the whole thing needs to be linked together. How do our land uses have to change? Where we are converting pasture into forest, afforesting it, shifting our diet off of meat and dairy to other things to make room for stuff. And this is where I think food systems and the built environment are so linked, right? Yeah. Because both of them ultimately have a relationship to the landscape. And actually, my other academic credentials, I'm at the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the Bartlett, and the focus here and the research we're doing here is kind of around these questions. I think around what is the future links between land use and the built environment through this specific lens. And the idea that if buildings are going to continue to emit, we need to find the offsets. We need to increase the uptake and the sequestration elsewhere. And the only place for that is the landscape, is the rural and suburban areas of a city. We can do that within a city, but at scale, we really need to rethink how our countryside operates. And I think that in combination with how we continue to build and plan our cities need to be connected. This disconnection historically between city and surrounds in all aspects of our life, be it our food, be it our buildings. We need to figure out how to really combine the forces here to really tackle what we're up against.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right about Ireland, by the way. I think that prehistoric Ireland used to be 90% forested. It was 90-something percent. And now today, Ireland has the lowest amount of tree cover per square meter in all of Europe, which is, most people wouldn't associate Ireland with massive deforesting, but that's reality. And you're right on the cause. It's overly intense, usually meat and dairy farming. Because the sheer amount of clear land you need for cattle grazing is much more compared to, say, wheat or grain farming, at least. And ironically, a lot of that is associated with subsidies that Ireland used to get from the European Union, which were specifically intended for pasture farming and for cattle farming. I think a lot of what you said there is actually linked to an issue that Will Arnold brought up in the last podcast, which is that we have this economic system, particularly in the West, which is premeditated on kind of continual growth. If you're not, if a company or a country is not continually growing economically, it's seen as failing, and that almost translates into this constant demand on architecture, on real estate, on buildings, and also on agriculture and other processes to keep growing, to keep producing new things. And I think that point about it's not just about what you build with, it's about building less overall. It's going to be a key point, and it's not just about how much food we're growing or what food we're growing. It's about trying not to waste food. I think it's something like between a third and half of all food produced globally is thrown away. And I know that's particularly true in the American context, in the Western context. There is a key element to climate change and to combating climate change is careful material use. It's not just what material we're using, it's how carefully we're using it. And as you say, trying to make do with what we have already, which we tend not to do. But yeah, I feel as though that model we have of a demand for constant growth and constant economic growth, I feel like that's a major impediment, or that's a major driver of some of the unsustainable practices that we're seeing. And it actually brings back to what I was wanting to ask a few minutes ago, actually, was about your experience engaging with policymakers. Because again, Will Ireland has done some of that here in the UK. I've even done some of that in the Irish context. How have you found it difficult to explain, particularly something like embodied carbon, to a policymaker? Because for years and for decades, our idea of sustainability, I think, was centered around, say, operational sustainability, things like solar panels, things like reusing water, reusing materials, whatever, or in an operational context.
Yeah.
An embodied context tends to be more invisible, you might say, to the everyday user, because again, most embodied emissions occur before a building is even opened or occupied. You don't often see embodied carbon or embodied energy at play in everyday use in a building. So was it more difficult to communicate some of these ideas to, say, a non-architectural audience or to a policy audience, or did you find that they were more open or receptive than you were expecting them to be?
I think more than I expected them to be. With some basic upfront explanation of what it is, and I think that the scale of it, I think that I think maybe the food industry, it's kind of on a theme here, has done a good job of explaining to people what the carbon footprint of your diet is, and then to translate that across to the diet of a building is pretty straightforward. And then the magnitude of it, once you understand the magnitude of construction, that it's globally 11% of our annual emissions. I mean, it's a significant chunk. And as an architect or planner or engineer, you realize, whoa, that's all my responsibility. It's a disproportionate burden, I think, on our discipline, and thus why we need to pay attention to it. And I think more recently, I've just co-authored a paper looking at the whole life carbon of envelope systems in Canada, and with my former building science professor, Ted Kessick, and a former student of mine, Julia Cook. And these high-performing envelopes, we put them in a north-facing, Toronto context where Toronto's grid intensity is very low, or about, I think, 74 grams on average, very green energy through hydro and nuclear. And assuming electric heating, the envelope of that high-performing passive house envelope, its embodied carbon is 19 times greater than the savings over the 60-year life cycle of that room. I mean, that's like crazy. If you think about that, like 19 times your emission over the savings of not having a wall at all, right? If you just had no facade and electric heating on all the time, that puts into context the decision making here. And it completely flips on the head, I think, everything that we were taught to think. Like, we have to go to extreme lengths to have our buildings well insulated. And I was like, well, you know what? It depends. It depends a lot on where you are in the world, right? What your source of heating is. There are parts of the world we should insulate right away, and there's other parts we should probably maybe like let's triage the for a medical perspective. Let's deal with the emergency patients first before we get to the folks with a cold. And I think that we don't look at it that way. We have a kind of, this is where I think the passive house movement, getting the unintended consequences of like something that's taken over, it really depends on where you are in the world for that argument to be made. Because just on a kind of Canadian example, if you're in Calgary, your argument for passive house is like 15 to 20 times greater than in Toronto, because of the power, the grid you're on is just, like basically it's thermal and a much higher intensity. And if you look at Europe, again, it really, the argument for passive house in Poland is great. It's not so good in Sweden. So we need to take a much broader view of what we're doing, both holistically through the life cycle of a building and globally. And that intensity grid also, that's where the question of material provenance comes in too. I think this is, as I tell people, it's not just about wood. It's like, what country is it coming from, or what province? Where's the sawmill? Because even wood cut and harvested in Alberta is 10 to 15 times less sustainable than wood cut and harvested in Quebec. That's a big difference. A tree is not a tree, right? The same can be said with aluminum being smelted in different places. So we need to really, there's no one answer. I think you need to spend the time to really dig into it and understand the provenance of your decisions, to actually be, I would say, practicing ethically and responsibly.
A final thing on the educational topic, which would be interesting to hear, is your view on the attitudes of students today versus like in 2022 versus maybe when you were at university or when you just graduated. Have you seen a shift in where students place climate and sustainability today versus before, and how serious or how seismic a shift do you think that's been?
Well, I think from the student side, just based on the statistics of the amount of people that balloted my studio number one, it's a demand. I think everybody's concerned about this, and certainly the students that I attract, it's a primary motivation. When I was a student, I cared about it, but I think that we would see this globally. The closer we're getting to this, it's a fucking red light emergency right now, and we need to behave like it. It didn't feel like that in 2008. It certainly feels like that every day right now in the circles that the information that I follow, and the urgency that we need to bring to this. So, that's what motivates me every day, and to teach and to practice, and to take time to talk to folks like yourself. Anybody that's hopefully listening to this that might think something differently on the back end of our hour here together, would be valuable. Would make all of this time valuable. And I think collectively, it's such a huge paradigm shift required of us. And I think the exciting thing about architects and for architecture right now, it's not just doing more buildings, it's actually creating a vision for everybody of what the world needs to look like, how different it will be. Having just spent the last week in Toronto and Boston, like imagine North America without cars. Like what would our cities look like? How much better would life be?
To wrap it all up, then, and I'm going to ask: are you hopeful or are you pessimistic about the future? You sound both. To me, you actually sound more hopeful. You can at least see. You can see what the problems are. You have a vision for either solutions or what an approach towards a solution might be. But taking everything, all these different facets of your career, your education, practice, engagement with policymakers, how hopeful or pessimistic are you on the ability of those in the built environment, designing, constructing the built, or making policy for the built environment to tackle climate change?
I have to be optimistic here. I think we just need to be optimistic and positive and convey the message to people that this is not the end of life. This is the beginning of it. This is we need to completely turn over the way we've been educated and practiced and live in a degrowth world. And I think that's a really exciting future. Frankly, how do we live with less, right? I think it's an absolutely fundamentally more beautiful place in many ways. The book I'm currently reading is the Dawn of Humanity, and it's talking about the early Jesuit accounts of encounters with First Nations peoples in the Great Lakes, the French Jesuits, and what's interesting is all the accounts kind of explain how egalitarian and happy the communities they are encountering were. How a lot of people had free time; they didn't want more, and that unanimously that the First Nations kind of accounts of the French kind of colonist life were like, you're spending all your time with these material pursuits, you're not happy, and you're complaining all the time. Like, why would I want to listen to you, right? And it's a kind of really interesting, and the best-selling books in Europe at that point were the accounts of these missionaries and their encounters with these people, because if you can imagine, they're describing a society that's completely equal, and that people are not in want of more things, and how radical that must have seemed for any European at the time, right? And just here we are, 400 or 500 years later, only now beginning to see it again that way, right? That the future of humanity is not one of endless growth and exploitation, but one of love and community. I think, and I hope that spirit. So we need to foster, I think, in this whole, this is the broader sustainability community. I think one thing I've, since kind of getting into it, so to speak, is that there's a sense of collaboration and support that is just really promising. And we just need to continue to bring that, I'd say, that love and empathy to any discussion and create the movement jointly. So anyway,
Absolutely.
Thanks for having a podcast, and hopefully this is part of this broader shift that we need to make.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm even as myself as a listener to this episode, it's been amazing just listening to your progress and your journey through all these different kind of mediums in architecture, whether it's education or practice or policy, and then Africa, America, Europe. It's incredible for one person to have this kind of holistic viewpoint. So it's been incredibly valuable for us to have your time. For people who want to follow you more and to get in touch or to learn more about you, where's the best place to find you these days?
Good question. I'm on LinkedIn. I've got my studio as an Instagram account called the Daniels Half Studio. And
this is your studio at Toronto.
University of Toronto. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got our studio Instagram, Daniels_half_studio.
Awesome.
Yeah, LinkedIn is kind of where I get most so much of the conversations happening there. I've just joined Twitter. Follow the Ukrainian war.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say generally, LinkedIn and Instagram are the two places. And then clearly, I think the work in mass that we're doing is, it's out there.
Awesome. Anyway, Kelly, it's been fantastic having you, and thanks. Thanks so much for speaking to us today.
Cheers, Neil.
That's all from us for now. So thank you for tuning into this episode of the Share Your Green Design podcast. Just a reminder before you go, you can subscribe to us over on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Or if you prefer watching the conversation, you can find us on YouTube. You can follow us over on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and WeChat at Share Your Green Design. That's all one word, Share Your Green Design. And remember, the podcast is only one small part of a much larger platform dedicated to sustainable architecture, engineering, and construction. To keep up to date with the latest projects, news, research, events, competitions, student work, and job adverts, head on over to shareyourgreendesign.com. Thank you everyone for your support, and we'll see you next time.